Bradfield Telly Town Hall with Paul Fletcher and Julian Leeser. We are just having people start to join us, so we'll kick off in a minute or two.
Hello, this is Laurie. I am your operator this evening.
Hello, Laurie.
Thanks. If you could start the dial now, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll begin that right now.
Thank you.
Okay, your dialing has begun.
Thank you.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Bradfield Telly Town Hall with Paul Fletcher and Julian Leeser. We'll be kicking off in just a minute or two, just as we're just waiting for people to join us. Well, good evening and welcome to the Bradfield Telly Town Hall, discussing The Voice with Paul Fletcher and Julian Leeser. We're just waiting for people to join us. Numbers going up quite rapidly now, and we'll be kicking off the formalities in just a minute or two. So if you wouldn't mind just waiting for a moment, and we'll kick off the conversation pretty shortly. Well, good evening and welcome to the Bradfield Telly Town Hall on The Voice. I'm Paul Fletcher, MP, and I'm joined by my parliamentary colleague Julian Leeser, MP. This is the second in my series of two discussions in relation to the proposed Voice to Parliament. It follows the first held a couple of weeks ago with Warren Mundine, making the case for no. And tonight I'll be speaking with Julian Leeser about the case for yes. Just before we get into that, I'm going to ask Uncle Michael West from the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council to give a welcome to country. Uncle Michael is a man of the Gomeroi Nation, born, raised and has lived his whole life in Sydney. So Uncle Michael West, over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to say Pojari Ginamarua and welcome to everyone to Eora Country. And I'd like to say welcome everyone here on behalf of the members and the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. It's an important time in Australia whenever we have a referendum. And it's important that we do have conversations and yarns, as we say. It always should be the case. Always treat people what I've been brought up. And here in Sydney, where we are in Eora, is a beautiful harbour. The harbour is a story of it being created by a giant eel, which has created the waterway and is now lying just off of Balmain with an eye, and that is called EML, E-M-L. And obviously, places like where you are, around wonderful city, you have the CBD of Gadigal, North Sydney, Camarega, where the southern Camarega. You have Wonga, where we have Women's World Soccer out, the Stadium Australia. Across the river there would be Wallamadigal, and obviously the name is Paramadigal, as you can understand. Those eels go to in their journey, and it's important that we, as Australians, we respect each other, and also it's important to look after our culture, Aboriginal culture, and our sites, because they are very old. More than 65,000 years. We have 40,000 years with the fish traps at Brewarrina are just one example. So we ask all Australians, whether naturalised or born Australian, to please look after our sites, because they're your sites too, for protection of humanity. But we also want you to stay strong in your culture and your identity. As we've learned the last few years of this pandemic, it has been important to connect with ourselves and better ourselves of who we are for our own self-care. It's also important we do take a moment of silence to pay respect to ancestors, pay respect to Mother Earth, pay respect to all those who've gone before us, pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owners, elders and custodians of the past and present, and also pay respect to those we've lost the last few years in this pandemic. We need to remember that they weren't numbers. They were people who had their own, as we do now, friends. They had names, they had families, and they were part of communities. And we always remember that and respect that. And it's also important just to centre ourselves and reflect our journey to this point in time in the continuum. So if we just have a short moment of silence, I will hold reflection and respect. The Eora Nation is bounded by aquatic rivers. That is the Hawkesbury, Nepean and Georges. We'd like to thank everyone for attending here tonight. As I said, always have conversations and yarns, treating each other with dignity and respect. From our members and elders, we welcome everyone here, any of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters. We welcome you from country, clan, tribe, nation. Also, what I was going to say too is we welcome all our brothers and sisters of that big tribe called humanity. We welcome you from your family, your neighbourhood, your community, ultimately country you come from, which is this wonderful little planet called Earth. May everyone have a great time tonight. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Uncle Michael West from the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, for that welcome to country. And for those who've just joined us, you're joining the discussion between me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, and my parliamentary colleague Julian Leeser, member for Brewarrina, on the subject of the voice. And so, Julian, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And perhaps you could start by telling us a bit about yourself and your involvement in this issue over quite a few years.
Thanks, Paul. Can I thank you for having me here? Can I thank you for providing this opportunity for your constituents to hear both the no side and the yes side in this debate? And can I join Uncle Michael in acknowledging country? I've been interested in the Constitution practically my whole life. I told the Parliament in my maiden speech I asked for a copy of the Constitution for my 10th birthday. It's a strange thing to do. I was perhaps an unusual child, but I've always been interested in the Constitution. I was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1998 on the Republic debate. I'm a strong constitutional monarchist. John Howard put me on the 10-member no case committee for that referendum. I was an associate to a High Court judge. I practiced in law. I was the constitutional law advisor to Philip Ruddock when he was Attorney General in the Howard government. I've served as the co-chair of the Committee on Constitutional Recognition in the Parliament, and I was Shadow Attorney General and Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. Relevantly for this debate, in about 2014, Noel Pearson was looking for a way to encourage constitutional conservatives, people like myself who are more likely to be found on the no side of a referendum, to find a way that they might vote yes in a referendum on constitutional recognition. And what constitutional conservatives like myself, like Anne Toomey, like Greg Craven said to Noel Pearson was that you need to find processes and procedures that work with the grain of the Constitution rather than against it. You need to find something that accords with our constitutional tradition. And our Constitution establishes institutions. It doesn't have a Bill of Rights. The previous proposal on the table from Aboriginal leaders was for a one-clause Bill of Rights, a so-called racial non-discrimination clause. That was broadly rejected. And so Noel began trying to find a way forward, and he worked with people like myself, Greg and Anne, to try and find a new method, and the new method that they put forward was the idea of a voice. And that's really been my history in this debate. Long interest in the Constitution, long involvement in constitutional debates, but one of the early architects of proposals for a voice to Parliament.
Well, thank you for that explanation, and perhaps with that you could briefly explain what the voice is intended to do.
So the purpose of the voice is to provide an avenue for the government and the parliament, and when we talk about the government we mean ministers and we mean public servants, to listen to Aboriginal people before they make policies and laws about them. Most of the laws, as you know, that we make in the federal parliament are laws of general application. They apply to all Australians. In 1901, the framers of the Constitution put into the Constitution a thing called the races power. It allowed the Parliament to make laws about the people of any race for whom it's deemed necessary to make special laws. In 1967, we added Aboriginal people to the class of people that the Parliament could make laws about. Since 1901, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the only people for whom we make special laws. We don't make special laws for Greek Australians or Italian Australians or Jewish Australians or Chinese Australians or Christian Australians, but we do make special laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And as we've seen, we haven't done a particularly good job of it. And that's not an adverse reflection on the current government, it's not an adverse reflection on people on our side of politics. It's just an acknowledgement that, we are failing. We're a great country, on every social and economic indicator, we're at the top of the world. But there's this gap that's not closing. And I believe that when you listen to people on the ground, when you ground truth policy ideas that are made by well-meaning people in the Canberra Public Service and, from colleagues in the Parliament, you get a better outcome on the ground. And that's what this is all about, trying to help close the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
For those who may just joined, you're listening to a conversation between me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, and my colleague in the Federal Parliament, Liberal member for Berowra, Julian Leeser, who is an advocate for the yes position on the voice to Parliament. Of course, the Liberal Party's position that we've adopted is a no position, and Julian resigned from the front bench, returned to the back bench so that he could advocate for this particular position. So Julian, can I ask you then, the forthcoming referendum is going to propose a change to the Constitution to establish an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. What is the significance of the voice being established through adding a provision to the Constitution?
Well, what I thought I might do, Paul, is actually go through what people will see on the ballot paper and also explain the provision, because I think it's important that people understand that. So it's about 25 years since we've had a referendum in this country, and on referendum day, the 14th of October, people will go into the ballot box and they'll see a question on the ballot paper. It says, a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. The question is, do you approve this proposed alteration? And if you support the alteration, you write yes in English, and if you oppose it, you write no in English. What this provision is doing is adding one new section to the Constitution, and the section reads as follows: in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Peoples of Australia. That's the recognition bit. We've been talking about constitutional recognition since the 1930s. This completes the Constitution. 1. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. That establishes a permanent body in the Constitution whose name is the voice. 2. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So that means that the voice's role will be to make representations or submissions to the Parliament, and when we talk about the Executive Government of the Commonwealth, we mean ministers and public servants, about issues that affect Aboriginal people. So we've got a permanent body whose job it is to make representations at the federal level to Parliament, ministers, the public servants. 3. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have powers with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So that's the part where we, the Parliament, control what the voice looks like, what its powers are, who serves on it, what its budget is, how its representations are received, how they're considered, its procedures, and it means that we can adapt it from time to time. So that's the provision. The reason why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want to have the voice in the Constitution is A, because as I mentioned before, there's this gap that doesn't close, but B, we've had bodies from time to time that have been introduced and abolished. What this does is it says there should always be a body. The body can be reformed, it can be changed. It's up to us as parliamentarians to change it. But there'll always be a body, and the purpose of that body should be to make representations.
Well, thank you for that explanation, Julian. For those who may just be joining, you're with me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, and my parliamentary colleague, Julian Leeser, Liberal member for Berowra. We've already had a few people who've submitted questions. If you're interested in submitting a question, what you need to do is press 0 on your keypad to pose a question, and a little later on we'll go to some of the questions that have been asked by those who are on the call. But Julian, let me ask you now, could the voice be established in ways other than through adding a provision to the Constitution?
The short answer to that is yes. But the reason why we are establishing it this way through the Constitution is A, because when Aboriginal people were consulted about what they thought constitutional recognition meant, in the most extensive consultation of Aboriginal people on this issue that led to the Uluru Dialogues, the Uluru Statement, they said constitutional recognition meant recognition in the form of a voice. Mm-hmm. And why did they want that voice? Because they've seen from time to time that bodies have been established and removed, and this gives a guarantee that a body will stay. It can be reformed, as I say, it can be changed to meet different circumstances, but it means that there's a guarantee there'll be a body going forward. And that's a benefit to public policymakers because it ensures that there will be a source of advice about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs in this country that's official and that's established in our Constitution.
Are there other ways presently that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can put their views to government?
Yes, there are all sorts of ways that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can put their views to government. They can put their views to government as ordinary citizens, by contacting the Member of Parliament, by making submissions to committees. There are a range of different other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bodies. But what's important about this body is by being in the Constitution, it will have a special status. It will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from the local and regional bodies that will be established underneath it. So it will be a body that's got a function that's connected to community, and because it's in the Constitution, it will have a status which I think people will pay more attention to.
You're listening to a conversation between me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, and my colleague Julian Leeser, Liberal member for Berowra, who is an advocate for the Yes case. We're discussing the voice to Parliament. This follows the earlier conversation that I held with Warren Mundine, who is an advocate for the No case. And Julian, can you talk a bit about Indigenous disadvantage in Australia and how you see the voice being effective to address Indigenous disadvantage?
As I said earlier, I think Australia is the best country on earth, and I think when you look at every social and economic indicator, we perform at the top of world rankings. But there's a gap in the performance and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the rest of Australia. That gap manifests itself in a range of ways. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have a life expectancy that's 8 years shorter than the rest of the population. They're 2.5 times more likely to die by suicide than the rest of the population. They're more likely to be living in housing conditions that have no kitchen and no sanitation. 1 in 2 Aboriginal Australians lives at or below the poverty line. In terms of educational outcomes, a young Aboriginal man is more likely to go to jail than to go to university. For me, this is a shocking thing because we are such a successful and prosperous country, and yet we've got this gap that just isn't moving. And that's why I think the voice is important, because I think it can provide a tool. It's not the silver bullet, but it will provide one measure whereby we can get advice to improve things on the ground. And let me give a couple of examples. I chaired the House Indigenous Affairs Committee, as I said earlier, and repeatedly we saw instances of public policy makers in Canberra making decisions that weren't ground truth. So I chaired an inquiry on food security in remote communities, and a lot of the food is grown in the south of Australia. Remote communities exist in the north of Australia. It takes a long time for food to get there. Often when it goes to communities, it sits on the shelf, it spoils quickly in hot conditions. The Canberra Knows Best scenario is to say, well, why don't we send more fridges to those communities? Except when you actually talk to people on the ground, you'll hear that electricity supply isn't reliable in those communities, and that's a challenge. So we see this repeatedly. There's a policy that the government is currently reviewing called the CDP. It's the Remote Area Employment Program, the Community Development Program. That applies differently in communities. Most people regard it as having been a failed policy. Part of the reason it's failed is that there's been no proper indication of the difference in communities. So if you're in a community which is in reasonable public transport distance to jobs in the general economy, the aim should be to get people from community to do jobs in the general economy. But there are many communities that are so remote that that's not possible, and you need a different solution for those communities. What this is about is, before governments roll out policy, saying to communities, these are the aims we're looking for. How will we get this policy right for your particular community?
You're listening to a conversation between me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, and my Liberal colleague, member for Barara, Julian Leeser, who's an advocate for yes in the forthcoming referendum on the voice. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions directly of Julian, so if you'd like to do that, please press 0 on your handset, and you can go into the group that will have the opportunity to ask questions. Can I ask Julian about the views regarding the voice amongst Indigenous Australians? Is there a unanimity of view? Are there differing views? What's your perspective on that?
As with the rest of the population, there's a range of different views in the Indigenous community, but we know a couple of key things. Firstly, the first time that Indigenous people were actually consulted on what they meant by constitutional recognition through the Uluru Dialogues, the consultation overwhelmingly said they didn't want symbolic recognition alone, they didn't want a racial non-discrimination clause, they wanted a voice. Mm-hmm. And that's why this is the proposal on the table. And surveys since that time have indicated that more than 80% of Indigenous Australians support this as the way forward for recognition. When you look at the number of prominent Indigenous advocates, the large number of prominent Indigenous leaders in our country are in favour of the voice as the method of constitutional recognition.
You've mentioned the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I think for people who've not been familiar with this issue or following it closely, that it can be a bit confusing. There's several different ideas floating around here. There's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. There's the Uluru Statement from the Heart. There's been a number of processes, but perhaps not every Australian has been following closely all of that work. Can you tell us what exactly is the Uluru Statement from the Heart and what is its importance?
So the Uluru Statement from the Heart came from the series of dialogues that were conducted, I think it was 2016-17, as part of the Referendum Council. Tony Abbott commissioned the Referendum Council to provide a way forward on constitutional recognition after the rejection of that one clause Bill of Rights. And part of the process was to consult Aboriginal people on what they wanted from the process of constitutional recognition. As I said, the proposal for the voice was developed back in 2014 between Indigenous leaders like Noel Pearson and Megan Davis and Marcia Langton, and constitutional conservatives like myself, Greg Craven and Anne Toomey. And it was workshopped through a range of different proposals to sort of test the legality. When Aboriginal people were given a range of different options, including the voice, including recognition in the preamble, including a one-clause Bill of Rights, they chose the voice. Through those consultations, other issues emerged, and at the end of those consultations that occurred around the country, delegates from those consultations met at Uluru, and they resolved to issue a statement that summarised some of the matters that they had discussed, and that statement called for, among other things, voice. I want to say to your listeners tonight, it's very important. The only thing we are voting on in this referendum on the 14th of October is the voice. The other matters that are contained in the Uluru Statement, like treaty, like truth-telling, are not on the table. They are not contained in this provision. If the referendum fails, it is completely open to the government to proceed with treaty and truth-telling. If the referendum succeeds, there is no guarantee that the government will proceed with treaty and truth-telling, although they've said that that's their policy. So other parts of the Uluru Statement do not depend on what happens to the referendum. The only thing that does depend on what happens in the referendum is whether we have the voice. It is we, the Parliament, asking the Australian people for permission to establish this new body to listen to Aboriginal people about the policies and laws that affect them, in order that we can get better outcomes in education, employment, healthcare and housing.
So that gives a little bit of context on the Uluru Statement, when it occurred, what led up to it, some of its content. You touched there on treaty and truth, and you made the point that the Uluru Statement from the Heart, as well as calling for the establishment of the voice, also calls for a Makarrata Commission to oversee a treaty process and a truth-telling process. Taking your point that that is not what is being voted on in the referendum, nevertheless, could you explain what these processes, a treaty process and a truth-telling process, are likely to involve?
Well, look, there's been little work at the Commonwealth level on either of these issues. The Joint Select Committee that Pat Dodson and I chaired heard some information about both those issues, but we made no recommendations in relation to the Makarrata Commission or agreement making. In relation to truth-telling, I think, and testing my memory here, that we had said that we thought if it was to occur, there should be discussions at the local community level reflecting the diversity of Indigenous experience. I know in my own electorate, and I'm sure the same is in yours, I find when I go to schools there is a real thirst to know more about the Aboriginal culture of the Darug Guringai people, to understand their traditions and their culture, and to learn more about black and white contact, both good and bad. And I think that's a good thing. But as I say, none of those things are on the table, and you can be for or against any of those things. It's not relevant to what we're voting on in this referendum. This referendum, we're voting on one thing and one thing alone, and that is to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people through a voice, which is a committee to listen to them on the policies and laws that affect them, so we can help close the gap and get better outcomes on some of those issues that we talked about earlier.
You're listening to the Bradfield Telly Town Hall with me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, and my Liberal colleague and advocate for Yes, Julian Leeser, member for Barowra. The politics can be complex sometimes, and while the Liberal Party has taken a position advocating for no, Julian is advocating for yes, and he's indeed moved to the backbench to do that. Now, there's an opportunity for participants in this call to ask questions. We've now got a few questions. We'll come to those shortly. In fact, quite a few questions. But if you've got a question you'd like to ask, please press 0 on your handset and you can nominate your question, and hopefully we will have the time to come to you. But just a couple more questions from me, Julian. Firstly, both major political parties support the constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. So why are the two parties taking different positions on the referendum?
I think there's been a view developed that if only we just had straight constitutional recognition, this would be a 1967 sort of result where 90% of us voted yes. In 1999, at the last referendum, the same day as the Republic referendum, John Howard put forward a preamble that included, among other things, constitutional recognition. 60% of Australians voted against that preamble. I don't think there's any necessary guarantee that if it was just constitutional recognition, that would be a laid out in the zero and we'd vote for it. But I think it's important to talk about the sort of common ground between the parties too. So both parties support constitutional recognition. Both parties are committed to the local and regional aspects of the voice. Where there's a difference is that the Coalition's position is that they are opposed to a national voice, and they're opposed to a national voice being in the Constitution. Whereas the government's position is that they are in favour of a national voice in the Constitution. What we're being asked in this referendum is to recognise Indigenous people and to put a voice in the Constitution at the same time. So one of the important things that I was able to negotiate with the government when I stepped down was a commitment to the local and regional bodies. So they put $20 million in the federal budget for that purpose. We in government, we put aside money in the last budget as well for the commitment to the rollout of the local and regional bodies. I think having bodies at the local, regional and national level will make a real difference. The national body has to be representative of the views and be a conduit of the views from the local and regional bodies to the National Parliament, to the National Public Service, to national ministers. And I think constitutional recognition allows us to say, yes, there's a guarantee there'll be a body. It has the role of representations, but we can change and reform what it does over time.
And last question from me, Julian, before we go to meeting participants, and we've got quite a few people who've nominated some pretty good questions. If the referendum does not succeed, does that mean we're really giving up on attempts to end Indigenous disadvantage?
No, I don't think it does. I think everybody is committed to alleviating Indigenous disadvantage, but we have a referendum which provides us with an opportunity to insert a mechanism into our constitution that gives us a specific way of listening to Indigenous people about policies and laws that affect them. And I'll just give you an example of why I think listening is important. I was in Victoria last week. I met with the Victorian Aboriginal Controlled Health Organisation. The incidence of breast cancer among Indigenous women and the rest of the population is about the same, but the incidence of death among Indigenous women is far higher. The Victorian Aboriginal Controlled Health Organisation did a series of consultations with Aboriginal women, finding out why they weren't getting screened. Aboriginal women found that hospitals with a clinical kind of feel are very traumatic places to be, and in particular with the association of hospitals with death is particularly foreboding. So in Victorian communities they created the Beautiful Shawl program, where they had culturally specific shawls for women with Indigenous motifs. There's real issues around modesty among Indigenous women as well, and they took some of the testing equipment to communities. The rates of cancer screening, breast cancer screening for women shot up, and that getting women screened is the first step, obviously, to reducing breast cancer deaths and so on. So it's a good example of where listening to and consulting with people, particularly where you've got a gap in performance, leads to a better outcome. And I think the voice provides us with a structural way of ensuring that when we're making policy, we will get better outcomes in the future.
Well, thank you, Julian. You're listening to me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, with my Liberal colleague, member for Browra, Julian Leeser, who is an advocate for yes, voting yes on the forthcoming referendum on the voice to Parliament, although the Liberal Party's position is to vote no. Politics can be sometimes complicated. With that, let's go to some of the questions we've got from participants. And I want to go first to Scott Sloan from Chatswood. And so, Scott, over to you.
Paul, first of all, thank you very much for making available Warren and Julian to this very important debate. I really congratulate you on the initiative.
No worries.
Julian, my question to you is that a couple of weeks ago, when listening to Senator Mundine, he, as I understood it, he was advocating very strongly for greater accountability for existing expenditure and programs as an alternative to establishing the voice and seeing that as the priority. And I wanted to know, given your length of service in Parliament, for which we're all grateful, I wanted to get your comments on that, because I assume that if this was an easy thing to do to obtain such accountability, somebody would have done it before, including the government of which you were a member. So do you think it is primarily a question of accountability for existing structures, or is there something more that needs to be done that can be done through the voice?
Well, Scott, thank you for that very good question. People might be aware that a couple of weeks ago the Productivity Commission handed down a report on the Closing the Gap refresh. Closing the Gap refresh was, I think, a great success of the Morrison government. For the first time, the community-controlled organisations, the states and territory government and the Commonwealth were all going to report on their achievement of closing the gap targets. What the Productivity Commission, however, found was that governments actually hadn't changed the way in which they were doing things. Consultation from governments effectively meant, here's the decision we're going to make, what do you think? And then they would go ahead and make the decision at any rate. And the Productivity Commission said what is needed is a very different approach that involves much more rigorous engagement. And they particularly pointed out a range of bodies, including the proposed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, as a mechanism which the Productivity Commission saw would provide greater accountability for government and the community-controlled sector in delivering accountabilities for the delivery of services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and thereby helping close the gap directly. So it's a really good question, because I think you've had even the Productivity Commission there indicating that there's a role that the voice can play in this particular issue. In terms of the accountability to Aboriginal people of the voice itself, I think this is a really important point as well. What we know about the voice is that we know it will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the local and regional communities. So that makes it very different to, say, the Indigenous Advisory Council that Warren Mundine chaired for Prime Minister Abbott and Prime Minister Turnbull, where he was appointed by the government of the day. This means that the people who are selecting the people to sit on the Voice, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the community, will keep those people accountable for the work that they do on the Voice itself.
Thank you, Julian. You're listening to a conversation between me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, and my Liberal colleague, member for Barara, Julian Leeser, who is an advocate for yes on the Voice, and this follows a similar conversation a couple of weeks ago with Warren Mundine, who's an advocate for no. I'd like to go next to Alison Newman from Wahroonga. Alison, if you would like to give us your question.
Hello, Julian. I just want to preface my question by saying that I'm absolutely supportive of closing the gap and putting forward, all the effort and funding and processes that are required to do that. But I'm struggling to understand why the Voice needs to be in the Constitution. So I do understand that there have been efforts to do it in the past, and then it changes Parliament, and that voice gets taken away. But I just don't understand why to single out a group with critical needs when there are many other groups of Australians that have their own critical needs. So my question is, can you get representation on a national level by Parliament introducing a law that there is a voice in the absence of a constitutional amendment?
So the reason why this is being put in the Constitution is that the Voice came about as part of discussions of what constitutional recognition would look like. John Howard put constitutional recognition in modern times back on the table, and every Prime Minister from Tony Abbott forward has pursued it in some form. But when Indigenous people were consulted about what they wanted constitutional recognition to look like, they said they wanted recognition in the form of a voice. Now, while you could have a voice passed by Parliament itself, the reason why Indigenous people are wanting the guarantee of a body in the Constitution is because there have been, from time to time, bodies that have existed and been abolished, and there's been periods like the period that we're in at the moment where there's been no effective Indigenous voice or body to provide advice to the Parliament. What this is saying is it's a guarantee there'll be some body in the future. The body's role will be to make representations, but Parliament can change what it does. Why is this there for Indigenous people and not for others? This is partly because of the special status of Indigenous people in our country as our First Nations people, and because of this historic disadvantage of a gap that doesn't close. It's a gap that doesn't exist in relation to other areas of the population. While I acknowledge there are other people in our community who are disadvantaged, the overwhelming gap exists in relation to Indigenous people, and it's not a small segment of Indigenous people. When you think 1 in 2 Indigenous Australians live at or below the poverty line, it tells you it's quite a substantial number of Indigenous Australians. That's why I think this is important to be in the Constitution.
Well, thank you, Julian, for that answer. Thank you, Alison, for that question. You're participating in the Bradfield Telly Town Hall. If you've got a question you'd like to ask, press 0 to speak to our operator, and we can lodge your question and hopefully get a chance to come to you. I'd like to come next to Jan Smithsonian from Hornsby. So Jan, over to you.
Hello, Julian. Thank you very much. My question is concern about High Court challenges justified? If not, why not? It's just an area that I haven't got my head around yet, and I'd like a bit more clarification on it, please.
So, look, thanks very much for the question, Jan. The provision that has come forward in relation to the constitutional amendment has been subjected to critical legal analysis by Australia's top constitutional law academics, by the Commonwealth Solicitor General. It's been supported by the former Chief Justice of the High Court, Robert French, by Justices Hayne and Gaudron, former Justices of the High Court, by former Chief Justice Bathurst of the New South Wales Supreme Court, by the Law Council of Australia, and all the constituent legal bodies as being a safe matter for constitutional change. Why, to use Tom Bathurst's words, the former Chief Justice of New South Wales, if there's a dispute between the Voice and the Parliament would win. And the reason it would win is because of the third paragraph of the amendment. The third paragraph of the amendment gives the Parliament the power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the voice, including the composition, functions, powers and procedures. That means that the Parliament will set the way in which the representations can be received. It will set the powers and procedures of the voice, and if public servants and ministers execute their functions in accordance with those powers and procedures, then those acts will be lawful.
Thank you, Jan, for that question, and Julian for that answer. Let's come to John Fulsham of Linfield. So, John, over to you to ask your question.
Hi, Julian, Paul. Thanks for the information session. My question is basically around if the voice does fail, and it seems to be some confusion in Anthony Albanese seems to say this is the only chance we've got, and he refers to various previous referendums. But if it did fail, would a government of either persuasion be able to, in 12 months' time, just put the first part, in other words, recognition, back to the people to have that recognition put into the Constitution, which probably wouldn't require a lot of finance or funding or anything? I think it'd go down very well with most of the population.
Thanks, John, for that question. If I can use the analogy of the Republic referendum, as I said earlier, I'm a very strong constitutional monarchist. I was on the no side for the Republic referendum in 1999. But during that referendum, there were people who said, who were Republicans, who said, we don't like this Republic, we shouldn't vote for this Republic. If we defeat this Republic, we will very quickly bring forward a new Republic referendum with a different model, with a directly elected president. That was 25 years ago, and there's been no call for a Republic referendum, despite having several Republican Prime Ministers on both sides of politics since that time. So I think this is an opportunity that we have today to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. It's a safe change. It's a change that provides not just for the symbolic recognition, but also recognition with a practical purpose as well. And while governments in the future may decide to put things forward, I think the experience of the Republic debate indicates that a referendum is not something that people want to have every day. It's something that takes a long time to get up. It's something that takes a long time to put on. It takes a lot of the political discussion time that we have as members of Parliament. And so it's unlikely, in my view, my personal view, to come again soon.
Let's come to Ariane Ilkani from St Ives. So, Ariane, over to you to ask your question.
Thanks so much, Paul and Julian. I wanted to ask the question, if the referendum succeeds, would there be any more steps after that point that, Julian, you would advocate for, to continue this journey towards reconciliation? Or would you say that this voice would essentially be final in that process? Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ariane, for the question. Obviously, if the referendum succeeds, then we as the Parliament have a big task ahead of us to put forward the legislation for the powers, procedures, functions and so on of the voice. That's the next step on the journey of reconciliation. I see the voice as an important step on that journey of reconciliation. Reconciliation means the bringing of people together. That's what this process is all about, in my view, and I think it's an important step. It's not the last step on the road, but I think it is an important step that will bring our country together, because it will help us close that gap in outcomes for Indigenous people with the rest of Australia.
Thank you, Ariane, for that question, and Julian for that answer. Let's come to Alan Hislop from Wahroonga. So, Alan, if you would like to ask your question.
Thank you for that opportunity to ask questions and find out more. My question is, if the yes case wins, the voice will have to use its power responsibly. If it is irresponsible or disruptive to good government, as has been suggested by some, a future government would have strong grounds to call another referendum, and the people could then remove the voice from the Constitution. I realise that's difficult, but the numbers are close for inserting the voice. If it proves unworkable, I feel that there'll be far more people against it, and it'll be easy to remove it. Is that proposition sound? And if so, is it a good argument to vote yes?
Well, Alan, thanks for the question, because it allows me to say a couple of things about the powers of the voice and the role of the Parliament in the powers of the voice. Firstly, the voice has only one key power, and that is the power to make representations. That's all. It doesn't have the power to make decisions. The decision-making organs of our country are elected members of Parliament like Paul and myself. The ministers, the public servants, they are the decision-making powers. The only power that the voice has is the power to provide advice. If the voice runs amok, as it were, the Parliament has lots of power to rein the voice in and to reform it. That's what it means in the third paragraph, that the Parliament has the power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the voice, including the composition, functions, powers and procedures. And if the voice isn't working for some reason, we can change the way it's composed, the powers it has, the procedures it uses. There's lots of scope for the Parliament to reform this rather than going back to another referendum. I think if this succeeds, it will be Parliament that adjusts this from time to time, and that's exactly what this provision proposes, that the circumstances for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will change, whereas the Parliament should have the flexibility to adapt the voice to the changing circumstances of Aboriginal people.
Thank you, Alan, for that question, Julian, for that answer. You're participating in the Bradfield Telly Town Hall with me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield, and with Julian Leeser, Liberal member for Barara and an advocate for Yes in the forthcoming referendum on the voice. And this follows a similar Telly Town Hall we held a couple of weeks ago with Warren Mundine as an advocate for No. I'd like to come to Elizabeth Kaziro from St Ives to ask her question. So, Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you, and good evening. I'd like to ask Julian about the national agreement on closing the gap, which was established really quite recently in partnership with all the Australian government, federal, state and local, and with the coalition of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peak organisations, and they're representing about 800 Aboriginal community organisations. So what I would like to know is the voice a duplication of this agreement on closing the gap, and why we're not hearing more about this national agreement and the role of the coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations.
That's a great question, Elizabeth. I think the key thing to say is it's not a duplication. As I said earlier, the Productivity Commission has said that that national agreement, while a terrific idea and a really good thing that we did during the life of the last coalition government, it's not delivering services because despite there being the presence of the community-controlled organisations, government is still acting in the same way it has in the past, which is effectively to say, here's what we want to do, we're coming to tell you about it, rather than actually engaging people properly in the process. And what the Productivity Commission has said is that there needs to be more accountability for the process. You might ask, well, why aren't the community-controlled organisations able to provide that accountability? That's because the community-controlled organisations are not about the recipients of the service, they're about the delivery of the service. So they're not the people to hold the bodies to account, they're the people to provide the services. So this is an accountability mechanism that could sit over the top of that and ensure that the federal government and the community-controlled sector is doing its job. And I should just say, the Minister for Indigenous Australians has said that the first 4 items in the in-tray of the voice will be closing the gap in education, employment, healthcare and housing. None of those are small tasks. I think that will keep the voice occupied for a long time, and the amount of consultation it will need to do in order to come up with better tailored solutions will be significant, and I think that that's important because that's what we're all trying to get at the end of the day.
You're participating in the Bradfield Telly Town Hall with Julian Leeser, member for Barara, and me, Paul Fletcher, member for Bradfield. And we've got just another few minutes, so if there's a question that's burning in your mind, now's your chance, and probably the last chance, to press 0 and get that question lodged. I'd like to come to Ryan Orsmond from South Turramurra. So Ryan, if you would like to ask Julian your question.
Hi Julian, thank you for taking my question. I think I'm a little bit confused as to understanding the practical application of the voice. How is 716 tribal groups voices going to be collated and represented as a single voice to Parliament?
So that's a great question, Ryan. I think the first thing to say is that when we're talking about the voice, we're talking about bodies at the local, regional and national level. And the design of these bodies will be a matter for the Parliament in the post-referendum world. The referendum is asking Australians to give the Parliament permission to establish these structures and to have that hook in the Constitution. The idea is that advice will feed up from the local and regional groups, and that will feed into the national voice body, and that national body will feed that information into the federal Parliament and the federal public service and the ministers. That's the way in which it's supposed to work, but the specific details on how that will work will be worked out through the Parliament in the post-referendum world.
Well, thank you for that answer, and let's come to Ian Spencer from Turramurra. Did you want to ask your question, Ian?
Yeah, thank you, Julian, for your very clear explanation that Parliament remains as the decision maker on all the issues advised on by the voice, and even on the voice's structure and procedures. I'm just curious, that what is it specifically that is scaring the Liberal Party about the specific and simple wording that's being put to us in the referendum at this stage? And Paul may like to.
Oops, sorry.
Apologies, Ian. We just accidentally pressed mute on your question, but I think we got the substance of it. So, Julian, over to you.
Well, look, Parliament is the key decision-making body here. Parliament has the ability to change and adapt the voice from time to time in accordance with changing circumstances. I mean, we all hope and look forward to the day when the gap is closed. We all look forward to that day. So the voice will change after that, but there will always be a need for the voice because, go back to the point I made earlier, there are a specific set of laws that we make in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We make things like native title laws. We have laws in relation to ab study. We have laws in relation to cultural matters and the like. It's important that the Parliament receives advice on those matters as well.
And Ian, I think you were inviting me to express a view on the question as well. Amongst the concerns that we have and that have been raised by people with relevant legal expertise are that in that third paragraph, which says the Parliament shall have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, very importantly it says the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws. So the argument is that limits the Parliament's power because the previous paragraph establishes that fundamental right for the voice as a body to make representations to the Parliament. So that is certainly one of the questions. I know that can sound quite dry and technical, but those are the kinds of drafting matters that get very carefully considered by a court if there is a challenge to legislation, for example, on the basis that it of a concern that it has essentially is beyond the Parliament's power. So those are some of the concerns. So I'd like to come next to Jeffrey Allmark from Warrawee. Jeffrey, if you would like to ask your question of Julian.
Paul and Julian, thank you very much for taking my call. I thought we already had a voice in Parliament. Aren't they called our elected members who already represent all Australians? afraid I'll be voting no.
Well, let's take that as a question. Indeed, there is a question in there, Jeffrey. So why don't we come to Julian to respond to that?
Jeffrey, I think that's a fair question. And most of the laws we make in the Federal Parliament relate to all Australians. But there are a specific set of laws that relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians only, and they're the only people for whom we make specific laws. We don't make specific laws about Chinese Australians and Indian Australians, about Christian Australians and Muslim Australians, but we do make specific laws about Indigenous Australians. And the nature of those laws and the nature of outcomes from those laws and policies has not been great. And I think this is about trying to improve the outcomes from those laws. That should derive better value for money from the Australian taxpayer by ensuring that we get better outcomes on the ground. And that's what The Voice is about. It's about establishing a committee to listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people so we can help them close the gap, so we can save some money, so we can better direct the policies and laws that affect them.
Well, can I say thank you to everybody for the questions that have been submitted. I think we've had a good range of questions. We haven't been able to get to all of them, although we did get to quite a significant number. So for those that we've not been able to get to, what we'll be doing is responding by email. We're just about out of time, but Julian, I wonder if you would like to perhaps make some closing comments about the decision that is facing about 17.5 million Australians, I think, on the electoral roll, including, of course, about 110,000 people in Bradford will be called upon to make a decision along with their fellow Australians. So any final words of advice you would have for the people on this call as they think about the vote they have to cast?
Thank you, Paul. I think the first thing I want to say is we are very lucky as Australians. There are very few countries in the world where the decision is left to the Australian people, the people of that country, rather than the parliamentarians, about changing the rule book of the country, the Constitution. It's a task that we should all consider seriously, and we should all take our best opportunity to get informed, and having these discussions is a really great opportunity for people to be more informed, whatever decision they may make. The reason I'm supporting the yes case in this referendum is that I think this is a great opportunity to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. It's an opportunity that provides us with a committee that will be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, called The Voice. Its job will help the government and the Parliament listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in order that we make better policies and can help close the gap in education, employment, healthcare and housing. On the 14th of October, I encourage Australians to vote yes.
Well, thank you, Julian, for your participation this evening. Can I thank everybody who's on the call or who is watching this online. And can I remind you that there was a similar event held a couple of weeks ago with Warren Mundine as an advocate for the no case. You can go to my website if you'd like to have another look at that, and we'll be posting the full video of this discussion on my website as well. So can I thank everybody who's participated in this discussion with Julian Leeser, Liberal MP for Barara, my friend and colleague and advocate for the yes case, and can I thank everybody who participated in the Telly Town Hall we had a couple of weeks ago with Warren Mundine, advocate for the no case. Ladies and gentlemen, it will now be over to you to cast your vote, and thank you for participating tonight. I hope you found these sessions useful in informing you as you think about the vote that you'll need to be casting in the referendum. And let's close on the point that Julian made. We are very lucky to live in a country where we can all exercise our choice in a democratic process. And so thank you for the work that you will be doing in casting your vote on what we now know will be October the 14th. So thank you very much, and thank you again, Julian.
Thanks, Paul.